What would it be like in having a hand in shaping the experience, vision, as well as overall vibe of a major global metropolis? Well, that's kind of what we're going to get into today, and we're going to do so by examining this profession of urban planning. And I have this wonderful guest. His name is Danny Brown, and he works for the city of Toronto. And in this talk, we get into all aspects of urban planning in terms of what it is, what it isn't, rewards, challenges, and all sorts of great insights. And if you have any interest in this field, you're gonna wanna tune into it. But I think it is probably about time to launch into this talk. But before we do, I would encourage you to check out the full-length audio version after you get through this video, and you can do so wherever you access your podcast. Just do that search for Life as a ... All right, well, let's get into things. Okay, well, first up is a clip of Danny explaining what it means to be an urban planner, as far as what he's experienced on the job, as far as what he's seen. So listen in. I think this is really terrific insight into this profession.
I like to think of urban planning as or urban planners as professional generalists. We sit at the intersection of a lot of more concrete or well-defined disciplines or other professions. So urban planning is a little bit of architecture, it's a little bit of economics, it's a little bit of ecology, it's a little bit of law, it's a little bit of community engagement and education. And what we do is try and find the connections between all those sort of disciplines or approaches to how people live together in society. And we strategize about how to make people living in society work cohesively to improve the quality of life of people. That's one way of looking at urban planning. Another way, and maybe a more straightforward way of describing it, is that planners are responsible for the wise use of scarce resources. So whether those scarce resources are land or money for infrastructure or the availability of road capacity, we think a lot about how to make sure that everyone can make do with what is available to them. And so for that reason, it can involve a lot of different things. It can be transportation, it can be economic planning, it can be school planning, or even space planning within a building on its own. Or how many buildings can you put in a given city or a community? And so it encompasses a lot of different disciplines and different approaches, but all of it really has to do with how communities function and how we can do that effectively and efficiently to realize different goals. And those goals can be subject to political winds, community desires, and the ethics and philosophies that may reign at any given era throughout time. This is, a profession as old as there have been communities of people living together and having to think about how do we allocate resources among ourselves efficiently.
Well, I have another clip to add a little bit more in terms of clarity as per what urban planning is all about. I think this is a really good one. And this is speaking to the point of, having assumptions about a job, of what it could entail or what it could be about, and then the actual reality. So what you're going to find here is Danny explaining some of his assumptions about the work, at least initially, the surface level sort of understanding or analysis of it, to what it actually turned out to be for him. So check it out.
But I definitely thought it would be more cohesive as I got into it. I assumed that, it would be more like SimCity because that's sort of the popular conception of it.
Yeah.
But it's really not. It's a lot more distributed and diffuse than that, and has a lot more soft skills than hard skills at the end of the day. We work with engineers to do, the building design or thinking about infrastructure. We work with architects and urban designers to think about the shape and form of a building. We work with lawyers to think about how those regulations interface with other things. We work with council and the public. So really, it's about communication, lateral thinking, creative thinking, and less so about, can you build a building yourself? That's what, constructors are for, and contractors and construction firms. Right. So it's a little bit of everything, but in order to
Mm.
understand how they all work together, you have to see the connections between those things and how they interact with each other.
One of my favorite segments on Life as the podcast is this segment called A Day in the Life. And it is as it sounds. Like we dive into, what's expected during the course of a day or a week. And I find this really gives you this nice window into the work, into the profession. So here's a clip of Danny breaking down what it looks like for him within the field of urban planning.
Your current work is with the City of Toronto's Parks, Forestry, and Recreation Division as a project officer in the Park Design Special Projects Group. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, what a typical day or even week looks like for you, if such a thing
Yeah.
even exists.
So, I mean, that's the key, I think, is that it's always a little bit different. There's always different things that you're doing week to week. A lot of the projects are long term. So you're working on something and grinding away at it. And it could take 3, 5, 10 years to realize a project to fruition with all of its, bumps and circular routes and, L turns and all those kind of things. What does a typical day look like? I mean, it's a desk job by and large. So, I'm sitting on a lot of Zoom calls, I'm answering emails. But on my best days and the best weeks are where I get to go out on site to where the work is happening. I get to work with landscape architects, contractors, engineers, other folks in the community, Indigenous folks, and meet them on the land and go to the places where we're doing the work and think about how it could be different and how it could be used better for more people. And when it becomes collaborative in that way, when I'm moving away from my desk and actually sitting around a table or out in the space with other practitioners, with community members, that's really exciting. But the day to day is mundane. And I think that's how change really gets made and how a lot of work happens is you're looking over plans and diagrams, you're writing memos to senior leadership or to city council, you're putting together PowerPoint decks. You're thinking a lot about how to convince people to make change on really complex projects. And that involves a lot of communication and a lot of collaboration. So yeah, it's a lot of meetings like this on Zoom or Teams. It's a lot of thinking about what's the best way to persuade someone, how to communicate complexity in really straightforward ways, and then how to actually translate that into a real world impact for what you're proposing to do with anyone.
Now, what I find really useful when you're evaluating potential career options is really diving into what the challenges are associated with the work. Now, if those things that you uncover are things that interest you still or potentially scare you off, that kind of gives you a bit of a telltale as far as whether or not this job could be for you. Now, I have this clip here of Danny explaining some of the challenges that urban planners do face. So I think it was a really great and insightful look at the profession and some of the realities associated with it.
How do we build more in a city where we kind of have to accept a trade-off? Like, yeah, there's going to be an impact on your single family home neighborhood. You might need to accept 4 stories of development in a neighborhood that has historically only had 2 stories of development. You may need to accept apartment buildings with 6 units in a neighborhood that typically only has 1 unit. And those conversations can be incredibly fraught. People who have lived in this city for decades are used to a certain, character of their community. And I know that some people listening to this podcast are going to roll their eyes at the concept of neighborhood character. But if I, stretch my empathy, I can imagine being, an 80-year-old Torontonian who grinded their life to live in the city to earn and, so I shouldn't have said earn, that's my own sort of bias there, but, have worked hard to land in the city and find a place for themselves in the city. And feeling like the city has changed around them and having like an emotional reaction to that change.
Yeah.
And it can be really hard to convince them of sort of the societal benefit of the change around them when they themselves are experiencing the change as construction disruption, as noise, as a vision of their life different from what they have lived with. And so I have an enormous amount of sympathy for folks who are experiencing that change, but I also, from an objective point of view and from a planning perspective, and as a young person also growing up in the city, staring down climate change and knowing what I know now about urban planning at history, I'm realizing we need to shift the levers of power, and we need to, some of that change needs to happen, and it's going to inconvenience some people. But from my perspective, that inconvenience is worth it for the collective outcome of building safer, more inclusive, more equitable, more affordable cities. And if that means that someone's single detached house now has a little bit of shadow on their backyard because the building 2 doors down is 4 stories instead of 1 or 2, like that's a trade-off as an urban planner in 2024 I have to make, and I'm helping make those decisions, cognizant that they're going to be upset with me. But that is the reality, because I also have a duty to the generations that come after me and to the other people who don't own a home with a backyard in the city. So that's the trade-off. It's exceedingly difficult, and you can imagine how emotional it can get. We've all seen the articles and maybe TikTok videos or snippets on YouTube of really tense community meetings. And they can get really heated. But these are people's lives, right? It's what's local to them.
I don't know about you, but I found that last clip to be really, really helpful. I mean, the level of detail and insight contained within it. Yeah, I mean, if you have an interest within urban planning, I think that one is either going to attract you or potentially push you away. But either way, I mean, these are both potentially good outcomes for anyone who's interested, in learning a little bit more about urban planning itself. Now, I do want to shift over into one last clip here where Danny's explaining what the meaning of the work is to him. Like, how does he make sense of it, philosophically speaking? And I think this is also another useful way of evaluating a job, and listening to people speak about the meaning behind their work. So anyway, have a listen.
It's been a long realization of my career so far, of sort of hanging up my cape and that superhero complex. I think a lot of people go into planning, and I'm going to be a little self-deprecating here, and I've said this to my friends too in planning, so I don't think this is out of turn, but I think people go into planning because they think they know better than other people and can make better decisions. But I have learned an enormous amount of humility, which is maybe ironic to say, but I do mean that genuinely. There is not, you get into this, I think, wanting to make change, right? Wanting to be that person who flips the switch and revolutionizes a city, that makes it different overnight. The reality is none of this happens overnight. It is a constant grind of small wins, incremental change that over time add up to meaningful shifts in culture or people's experience of a city. So I really can't point to any one thing, but I can point to dozens of small things that I've been able to do. And I think what I've realized is that there isn't going to be a period where the work is finished and I look back and go, I'm done. It's finished. I did it. Like, I accomplished it. Instead, there's only the work. That's why they call it work, because you just keep doing it. There's more work to be done after me. There's lots of work that I'm doing that is dependent on the work that came before me. So I will be part of a long process of generations of work to build a city that I love, that other people love. And it's going to continue to be great as long as people who love it continue to invest in it and continue to do work in it.
Well, I think it's about time to wrap up this video, but as always, I do encourage you to check out the full-length audio version. There's so much more contained within it. For example, we get this inside look at how technology such as AI is shifting and changing the world of urban planning. We also have this really engaging story that Danny shares and a lot more. So again, you can find this wherever you access your podcast. Just do that search for Life as a ... And as always, I would definitely really appreciate a like or subscribe. It's the best way to let this YouTube algorithm know that the content matters. And finally, I will have another episode, another profession covered, coming at you right next week. So don't miss it. All right, we'll see you then.